Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Ben, and today I'm taking you into the story of the Hilliard, Florida Family Massacre, a 5-year-old girl's escape from a killer's rampage, which took place on the 24th of July, 2025, in the small town of Hilliard, Nassau County, Florida, USA. Against the backdrop of 3 generations of women murdered in just minutes by the very man who was once their husband and son-in-law. The central figures are victim Marissa Leroux Rowell, 32, her mother Sandra Gale Fogarty, 71, her sister Alicia Lael Fogarty, 33, and the suspect Christopher Bobby Rowell, 34. Let's uncover the full story together. And if this is your first time here, I'd greatly appreciate it if you could give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. The front door was still unlocked. The television still hummed. A child 5 years old stumbled into the humid Florida night, streaked with someone else's blood, and pounded on a neighbor's door. "Help," she said. "Mommy, Nana, Auntie." Inside the small house on West 12th Avenue in Hilliard, Nassau County, 3 women lay where they had fallen, one between the living room and dining area, one in a bathroom, another in a bedroom, felled in minutes by a black SKS-style rifle. The alleged shooter, a 34-year-old man the family knew better than anyone, had turned the weapon on himself. When deputies arrived on the 24th of July, 2025, he still had a pulse. The women did not. The child did. She had seen enough to understand something no 5-year-old should ever be asked to carry. By sunrise, the scene had been frozen behind tape and floodlights. The sheriff's tone was flat, professional, and edged with disbelief as he briefed reporters. Domestic, family, no random intruder. No stranger in the night, just a home, a history, and a pressure that finally detonated. In the hours that followed, names began to harden into headlines. A 32-year-old mother, her 71-year-old mother, and a 33-year-old sister. A community built a fund to cover cremations. Detectives mapped casings, measured angles, logged timestamps. The child was placed with relatives. The house grew quiet. But what happened is not the same as how it happened, and how still doesn't explain why. Was this a sudden, shattering eruption or the endpoint of a pattern that had been visible to those who knew where to look? Had the warning signs been ignored, minimized, explained away? Somewhere between those rooms, amid the echo of shots and the silence after, lies a sequence: choices, conflicts, triggers that turned an American home into a crime scene. We will walk that sequence step by step, carefully, clinically, humanely, until we answer the question that matters most. What did the little girl really survive? And what was left behind in that house besides bodies and brass? Because once you see the first crack, you notice all the others, and the picture they form is not an accident. It's a map. Hilliard is a small town tucked into the far north of Florida, a place where neighbors wave from porches, and the county fair is still marked on calendars months in advance. On West 12th Avenue, the white single-story house had been part of that rhythm for years, a home for 3 generations of women, and until recently, a man who was supposed to be part of the family's foundation. The youngest adult was Marissa Leroux Rowell, 32. She was a mother before anything else. Friends describe her as protective but gentle, someone whose voice softened when she spoke to her daughter. She worked part-time, balancing shifts with school runs and bedtime stories, often leaning on her own mother for support. That mother, Sandra Gale Fogarty, 71, was the family's matriarch. Retired but far from idle, Sandra tended a small garden in the backyard and was known for baking pies for church events. She had weathered her share of life's storms, and friends say she carried herself with the calm of someone who had learned to endure. The third woman, Alicia Lael Fogarty, 33, was Marissa's younger sister. She split her time between helping with childcare and working locally, and was described as fiercely loyal to her family. All 3 shared the house not just out of necessity, but out of a bond that had deepened after Marissa's marriage began to fracture. That fracture was centered on Christopher Bobby Rowell, 34, Marissa's husband. Public records show he had previous brushes with the law, nothing that screamed imminent danger, but enough to leave a paper trail of volatility. He had worked in manual labor and odd jobs, and neighbors recall seeing his car parked outside the house less frequently in the weeks before the shooting. Some describe him as quiet. Others say his temper could flare without much warning. Law enforcement has not publicly detailed the couple's marital history, but what's clear is that by late July, the relationship was strained enough that Christopher was no longer a constant presence in the home. Whether that absence was voluntary or enforced is a detail investigators have yet to share. What they do note is that on the night of the 24th of July, he entered that house armed with a semi-automatic rifle, and by the time he turned it on himself, 3 women were dead. The timeline of their last hours together is still being pieced together. Did he come to talk? To intimidate? Or was the decision already set in his mind before he ever pulled into the driveway? The surviving child may hold fragments of that answer, but some details may remain locked inside the only other witness now deceased. What pushes a man from estranged husband to family annihilator is rarely a single moment. It's a slow burn, an accumulation of perceived slights, control slipping away, or an identity crumbling without warning. In Christopher Rowell's case, the trigger was literal, but the metaphorical one may have been pulled long before. And when we follow that shadowed path backward, it might lead us to signs that were visible to those closest to the family. Signs that, in hindsight, are impossible to ignore. The 24th of July, 2025, began like any other Thursday in Nassau County, humid, heavy, and unremarkable. By nightfall, it would end with 3 bodies, a wounded shooter, and a child running barefoot through the dark. The details, as reconstructed by investigators, tell the story of minutes, just minutes, that unraveled 3 generations of a family. Christopher Bobby Rowell's car pulled up to the house on West 12th Avenue sometime after dusk. It's unclear if anyone inside expected him. There had been no reported argument that day, number 911 calls preceding his arrival. But he came armed, an SKS-style semi-automatic rifle, a weapon designed for military conflict, not domestic conversation. Neighbors didn't hear a door forced open, suggesting he either had a key or was let in. Inside were his estranged wife, Marissa, her mother, Sandra, her sister, Elisha, and his 5-year-old daughter. Whatever words were exchanged first are lost. What remains is the sound that followed, sharp, repeating, unmistakable. The first victim appears to have been between the living room and dining area. Investigators believe she was either confronting Christopher or simply caught in his immediate line of fire. The impact of the SKS round is devastating high velocity, tearing through bone and tissue in an instant. She collapsed where she stood, the furniture around her spattered in an arc that mapped the bullet's trajectory. The second victim fled toward the bathroom, perhaps thinking a locked door could buy seconds. It didn't. 1 or 2 shots breached the narrow space. When deputies arrived later, they found her crumpled near the tub, the tile beneath her slick with water and blood. The third victim was in a bedroom, possibly hiding, possibly trying to shield the child. She was struck and fell where she lay. The order of these killings is still being verified, but the medical examiner's preliminary report indicates they occurred in rapid succession, likely under 2 minutes from the first shot to the last. Amid the chaos, the little girl ran. We don't know if someone told her to go or if instinct took over. She made it outside, across the yard, and to the neighbor's porch, bloodied but uninjured. Her knock was frantic, her words clear enough to send the neighbor straight to the phone. When deputies arrived, they found Christopher in the house, a self-inflicted gunshot wound to his head. He was still breathing but unresponsive. The rifle was nearby, its magazine partially empty. He was transported to a hospital, where he was later pronounced dead. Investigators marked the house with numbered placards, shell casings in the living room, bathroom, bedroom, blood patterns on walls and floors, footprints, some bare, some in shoes, traced through the space. The air was thick with a metallic scent of blood and the acrid residue of gunpowder. The television still played in the background, oblivious to the fact that its audience was gone. We know the weapon, the time, the victims, the shooter. What we don't know, at least not yet, is the trigger before the trigger. Was this a premeditated execution or a sudden explosion? Were there threats in the days before? Did anyone see it coming? Those answers are buried in witness statements, phone records, and the memories of a child who should never have to testify. By the time crime scene technicians finished, the home was less a place of living than a diagram of violence. Each room told a part of the story, but the full narrative required connecting the movement, timing, choices made in seconds. And somewhere in that sequence, between arrival and self-inflicted shot, lies the pivot point. The moment when whatever Christopher came to do became something he could not walk away from. And to find that moment, we have to step back from the carnage and follow the investigation as it unfolds. Because in cases like this, the why is the only thing more elusive and more dangerous than the how. The call came in at 9:17 p.m. A child at a neighbor's door, screaming that her mother, grandmother, and aunt had been shot. Nassau County deputies were dispatched within seconds. By the time the first units arrived on West 12th Avenue, the night air was split by the wail of sirens and the beam of flashlights sweeping across the quiet street. Deputies entered through the unlocked front door, stepping into what was now a crime scene. Training takes over in moments like this first. Ensure the shooter is no longer a threat. They found Christopher Bobby Rowell in a back room, still breathing but critically wounded from a self-inflicted gunshot. The SKS-style rifle lay within arm's reach, its black metal gleaming under the harsh beam of a tactical flashlight. Medics moved in, stabilizing Christopher enough to transport him to UF Health Jacksonville. He would be pronounced dead shortly after arrival. For the victims, there was nothing to be done. The medical examiner was called to document and recover the bodies. Crime scene technicians began their work under portable floodlights. Each spent shell casing was photographed and tagged. Blood spatter patterns were mapped to determine firing angles and victim positions at the time of impact. Swabs were taken for DNA, though in a domestic case with a single suspect, the physical evidence served more to confirm than to identify. The child was taken to a safe location and given a preliminary interview by a child forensic specialist. She could describe the sound of the gun, the room she ran through, and where each woman had been when she last saw them. Detectives noted her account aligned with the physical layout and evidence in the home. The rifle was traced back to a private sale legal in Florida, but leaving little in the way of paperwork. Investigators are examining whether Christopher had made modifications to the weapon or stockpiled ammunition in advance, which could point to premeditation. Detectives combed through Christopher's phone, social media, and recent text messages. Early findings suggest financial stress, possible disputes over custody, and a history of verbal conflict. There were no active restraining orders, but there had been at least one prior domestic disturbance call to the address no charges filed. In most homicide cases, the next step would be to present evidence to the state attorney's office for charges. Here, with the suspect deceased, the criminal case ends before it begins. Still, the investigation remains active to establish a full timeline and motive critical for the family, the public, and any civil proceedings that may follow. Sheriff Bill Leeper held a press conference the next morning, standing against a backdrop of microphones and camera tripods. His words were measured. "This is a tragedy on a scale that's hard to put into words. We have a little girl without a mother, grandmother, or aunt because of one person's actions." He did not speculate on motive, but he did stress the importance of recognizing warning signs in domestic situations. Behind the scenes, victim advocates began working with the surviving child's extended family. A GoFundMe page circulated through the community, raising funds for funeral expenses and the child's long-term care. The case file now holds hundreds of photographs, dozens of interviews, and a stack of forensic reports. And yet, key questions remain. When did Christopher acquire the rifle? Did he make any final phone calls before arriving at the house? Was there an argument that triggered the violence? Or had this decision been locked in for days? These are the threads detectives will keep pulling, threads that may, or may not, lead to the moment the course of that night became irreversible. And when we step into the courtroom, even hypothetically in this case, we see how those threads would have been woven into testimony, exhibits, and the story the prosecution might have told had they ever had the chance. There would be no trial in the legal sense. With Christopher Bobby Rowell dead from his self-inflicted gunshot wound, the criminal case ended at the crime scene. But in the days that followed, the investigation findings were presented in briefings, media reports, and within the community playing out almost like a courtroom drama without the courtroom. If Christopher had survived, prosecutors in Nassau County would likely have pursued 3 counts of first-degree murder, armed with overwhelming physical evidence. The weapon recovered at the scene, ballistic matches between the rifle and the spent casings, blood spatter analysis, and the testimony of the surviving child. Florida law allows for the death penalty in cases involving multiple victims, particularly when premeditation can be established. In a real trial, the prosecution's narrative would have been straightforward but devastating. Christopher entered the home with a loaded SKS-style rifle, targeted 3 unarmed women, and attempted to ensure no witnesses remained except the child who escaped. The forensic timeline, supported by the child's account, would anchor their case. The defense, if mounted, might have challenged the premeditation element, perhaps pointing to emotional distress or claiming a sudden confrontation escalated into violence. But the nature of the weapon, the number of shots fired, and the targeting of victims in different rooms would have made that argument difficult to sustain. Without an actual trial, the sheriff's press conferences became the primary source of official narrative. Sheriff Bill Leeper was measured but unflinching, describing the sequence of events, the recovery of the rifle, and the evidence indicating Christopher acted alone. He did not provide speculative motives, noting that the investigation's purpose now was to document, not to prosecute. Local media filled in personal details, photographs of the victims, recollections from friends and coworkers, and the human cost of the crime. These stories serve the function that victim impact statements might have had in court, showing the lives erased and the ripple effect on those left behind. On social media and in community meetings, residents discussed what justice could mean in a case where the perpetrator was beyond the reach of law. Some called for stronger domestic violence prevention measures, others for tighter regulations on private firearm sales. A GoFundMe page for the victims' funerals and the child's future surpassed its goal within days, becoming a public expression of grief and solidarity. Even without formal proceedings, the investigation file remains open to review. Detectives will finalize their reports, and those documents will stand as the permanent record what the court transcript would have been. They will also be available to any attorney representing the child in future civil actions, such as wrongful death suits or claims on the suspect's estate. There is no gavel strike, no jury foreperson rising to read a verdict. Instead, closure, if it comes at all, will be found in the facts established beyond reasonable doubt that on the 24th of July, 2025, Christopher Rall was solely responsible for the deaths of 3 women, and that the only reason a 4th victim lives is because she ran. And when we turn from the absence of legal judgment to the analysis of the mind behind the crime, we move from evidence to insight, searching for patterns that might explain, or at least illuminate, the violence that unfolded in that small Florida home. Family annihilation is a term criminologists use to describe the murder of multiple family members by a parent or spouse. It is rare, but when it happens, the dynamics are both deeply personal and chillingly patterned. In Christopher Bobby Roll's case, the available facts suggest a blend of personal grievance, perceived loss of control, and access to lethal means conditions that, in combination, can turn volatile conflict into irreversible violence. Interviews with friends and family paint a picture of a relationship in decline. Marissa had distanced herself from Christopher, and his presence at the house had become irregular. In cases like this, the loss of daily control over the home, over the partner, over the child, can be perceived as an existential threat to identity. For some offenders, this perceived loss triggers a last-act mentality. If I cannot have them, no one can. Choosing an SKS-style semi-automatic rifle is not accidental. It is a weapon designed for sustained fire and maximum lethality. Bringing such a firearm into a home full of unarmed family members is a declaration of purpose. Even if Christopher had entered without a fully formed plan, the presence of that rifle drastically narrowed the range of possible outcomes. The speed of the killings, 3 victims in separate rooms within minutes, suggests a focus and determination inconsistent with a purely spontaneous outburst. Yet, there's no evidence so far of a detailed written plan, farewell messages, or staged preparations. This places the act somewhere in the gray zone, between premeditated execution and impulsive rage, fueled by long simmering resentment, financial strain, possible disputes over custody, and a history of verbal conflict add layers to the psychological profile. Each stressor on its own might be survivable. Together, they can corrode judgment and amplify grievance. For an individual already prone to volatility, the mix becomes dangerous, especially when combined with the means and opportunity to act. One question stands out: why did the child survive? In some family annihilation cases, offenders kill all present to erase the family entirely. In others, they spare children, sometimes as an act of twisted mercy, sometimes because the opportunity to kill them is interrupted. The fact that the child escaped suggests either a momentary lapse in Christopher's focus or an intentional choice not to harm her. Understanding which is true could offer insight into his final mindset. The self-inflicted gunshot is consistent with the murder-suicide trajectory common in domestic massacres. Once the primary act is complete, the offender's options narrow to two: face the legal system or end their own life. Suicide in these cases can be motivated by guilt, fear of punishment, or a belief that life after the crime is meaningless. From a preventative standpoint, the signs, though subtle, were there: relationship breakdown, history of domestic conflict, possible isolation, access to firearms. Each on its own might not trigger intervention. Together, they form a constellation that law enforcement and support networks need to treat as high risk. Christopher Rowell's case underscores a grim truth. The mind capable of killing 3 loved ones is often not overtly monstrous until the moment it acts. The violence is sudden, but the path to it is built over time, choice by choice, resentment by resentment, until there is no turning back. And as we step away from the mind of the killer and into the broader wake of the crime, we see how a single night's violence ripples outward into court records, community grief, and the life of the only survivor. In the days after the murders, the house on West 12th Avenue stood silent, its windows dark, its lawn overgrown. Yellow crime scene tape had been removed, but the weight of what happened lingered in the air. Neighbors walked a little faster past the property, their glances flicking toward the front door before looking away. The surviving child was placed in the care of relatives. Counselors from the county's Victim Services Unit began working with her, knowing the psychological scars would last far longer than the bruises from that night. A GoFundMe page, set up by friends of the family, surpassed its goal within days. Funds earmarked for funeral costs, cremation, and the girls' long-term care. Funeral services for Marissa, Sandra, and Alicia were held together, a choice that reflected both the closeness of their lives and the shared tragedy of their deaths. Mourners filled the small-town church, spilling into the parking lot. Inside, photographs of the 3 women smiling at birthdays, holding the little girl, tending the garden were displayed on easels. The child did not attend. Local and regional news outlets covered the story extensively, updating as details emerged from the sheriff's office. Online, the case drew both grief and outrage. Some commenters demanded stronger gun control, particularly around private sales. Others focused on domestic violence prevention, calling for more resources to identify and intervene in high-risk situations. While the case did not spark immediate legislative change, it added to the chorus of voices urging Florida lawmakers to close loopholes in firearm transactions and to strengthen protective measures for potential domestic violence victims. Advocates pointed out that many family annihilation cases share warning signs: relationship breakdown, prior domestic disturbances, and firearm access that are too often treated in isolation. For the community of Hilliard, the crime became part of its story. Parents grew more alert to changes in their neighbors' relationships. Teachers watched their students more closely for signs of distress, and each time the surviving child was seen holding the hand of an aunt, walking into school, people were reminded of what she had endured. Without a trial, there would be no verdict, no formal declaration of guilt. Closure, if it comes, will be personal, not judicial. It will live in the small acts of care for the survivor, in the community's refusal to let the victims be reduced to a crime statistic. And yet, Unanswered questions remain. Why did no one see the final act coming? Could intervention have been possible? The silence of the house offers no reply, only the memory of what happened when its door last closed. Because sometimes, justice is not a sentence handed down in court. It is the collective memory of a community refusing to forget. From this heartbreaking case, we're reminded that domestic violence isn't always easy to spot. The cracks in a relationship, the quiet tension, and subtle changes in behavior are often ignored until it's too late. When a relationship spirals downward and anger meets easy access to a firearm, tragedy can unfold in minutes, but the pain lasts for a lifetime. It's vital that we pay closer attention to the people around us. Listen without judgment, reach out, and never hesitate to seek or offer help when we see danger signs. Don't assume that could never happen here. Tragedy can happen anywhere, even in the quietest, most tight-knit communities. I want to hear your thoughts. If you knew someone was in a high-risk situation like this, what would you do? How would you approach them in a way that keeps them safe without making things worse? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your insight and story might just save someone's life. And if this video resonated with you, please share it so more people understand the importance of recognizing and preventing domestic violence.